Mr. President!
Ben! It's good to see you. You look terrific.
I want you to meet my very dear friend, Mr. Chauncey Gardner.
Well, Mr. Gardner, I'm a man who appreciates discussing a frank discussion.
As long as the roots are not severed, in a garden, growth has its season. And then we get spring and summer again.
I think what our insightful young friend is saying.
In Washington, D.C., a gardener named Chance lives in the estate of an old, wealthy man named Mr. Jennings, passionately tending the garden each day. Having been brought to the estate when he was really young and kept within the four walls of the estate for decades, completely sealed off from the outside environment, Chance's only knowledge of the world comes from TV, which he spends the majority of each day watching and absorbing. Through TV, Chance develops his vocabulary. Luckily, the only other staff member at the estate, Mr. Jennings' cook, Louise, who has also lived there for years and has known Chance since his childhood. One morning, Chance wakes up and lies in his bed for a little while before getting up and ready to start his day. After a few minutes, he turns on the TV and starts dusting his room and Mr. Jennings' vintage car to the rhythm of the song playing on TV. He then takes a break and watches some cartoons, studying them with childlike fascination, and once he's had enough, flips through some channels. Chance then changes his pajamas, puts on an elegant vintage suit, and heads to the dining room, where he turns on the TV set and quietly watches while waiting for Louise.
Good morning, Louise.
He's dead, Chance.
Not knowing why Louise is upset, Chance stares at her with a blank expression. Luckily, Louise quickly realizes who she was talking to, and her anger dissipates as quickly as it came over. She politely apologizes for her momentary outburst, offers to make Chance some eggs for breakfast, which he delightfully accepts, and leaves the room. After eating his breakfast in front of the TV, Chance goes upstairs to the old man's room to see him and finds his body covered in sheets. Chance slowly and curiously pulls back the sheet, and in a gesture of solemn farewell, he puts his hands on the old man's forehead and stares at the lifeless figure for minutes. He then sits on the bed, right next to the body, and not knowing what else to do, turns on the TV and watches some ads. Moments later, as Chance flips through the channels, he hears a greeting phrase, repeats it to himself, practices it, and the gesture that accompanies it for a bit, before quietly walking back out of the room. Chance goes downstairs, puts on his boots and apron to protect his precious suits, and heads to the garden. There, just like he does every morning, Chance tends the plants, which seems to be the only thing he knows how to do, and despite the tragedy that has occurred, looks calm and at peace. A few minutes later, seeing Louise approach him, Chance stops his work and offers her the new greeting and gesture he had learned and practiced earlier.
Ain't you the gentleman this morning?
Despite Louise's direct message, Chance remains unable to grasp what she means exactly. Hence, he quietly watches Louise walk away, and once she leaves, he slowly and casually bids her farewell, as if she would return after running an errand, and resumes his chores. Later, after finishing up, Chance heads back inside and finds all the furniture covered in sheets. Unfazed by this and still unable to grasp the gravity of the matter, pulls back the sheet off the TV and starts watching a game show. Chance then flips the channel to the news, which shows the U.S. president welcoming foreign dignitaries, and starts practicing them by himself, repeating the gesture over and over again. A few minutes later, the estate lawyers, Thomas and Sally, arrive at the house. However, as they walk further into the house, which they expected to find empty, they are surprised by the TV sounds. Follow them to the dining room and see the gardener glued to the TV. There, the lawyers introduce themselves to Chance, who offers the practiced handshake he has just learned before turning his attention back to the TV.
Are you waiting for someone? An appointment?
Surprised by what they hear, the lawyers politely inform the gardener that there hasn't been a man employed at the estate in decades, other than a mason who had worked on a wall a couple of decades back. Without arguing the lawyer's records, Chance proudly shows them around the house and casually shows them the wall the mason had repaired back then, as if to prove he knows the estate like the back of his hand, and even describes the man.
You have me. I'm here.
Then, Chance shows the lawyers to the garage, where the late Mr. Jennings' vintage car is parked.
I've never been allowed outside of the house.
Hoping to prove that he has in fact been living there, Chance leads the lawyers to his room and explains that the late old man had introduced him to television and given him a set of his own. He then shows them the remote control and proudly demonstrates how it works. He also shows them his bathroom, his wardrobe, filled with the old man's vintage clothes, which he had been allowed to keep, and his bed.
I'm allowed to go to the attic and wear any of the old man's clothes.
Perplexed by the whole interaction, Thomas gets straight down to business. Seemingly relieved and not knowing what else to do, Thomas informs Chance that even if he had in fact been living there, the estate is now officially closed and gives him until the next afternoon to move out.
Indeed, you have resided here. You have no legal right to remain. You'll have.
As the lawyers proceed to leave, hoping to help out the seemingly clueless gardener any way they can, Sally turns back and asks Chance if he can provide them with his medical records or the address of his doctor or dentist, and is surprised to learn that Chance doesn't have either and has never even been to a hospital. Disappointed and confused, the lawyers bid farewell to Chance, who once again gives them a firm handshake, just like the one he had practiced, and leaves the estate. Once he's alone, Chance goes to the attic to get an old suitcase, and while watching TV, he packs his clothes and his whole life in a single suitcase. He then takes an umbrella, turns off the TV after flipping through the channels one last time, and proceeds to leave, but hesitates out of fear. After standing by the front door and watching the streets through the window for minutes, Chance summons his courage and steps out into the outside world for the first time since he had arrived at the estate decades ago. Despite his strong urge to return to the house, Chance slowly walks down the steps, reaches the sidewalk, and starts walking in a random direction, taking in his surroundings with a mixture of confusion and fascination, and takes in the buzzing life of the city. After walking some distance, Chance carefully crosses the street, sees a group of boys hanging out, gives them a subtle greeting from afar, and continues on his way. He then comes up on another group of boys playing basketball and stands there for minutes, watching them in fascination. He continues wandering aimlessly through the city for hours and approaches a woman.
Could you give me some lunch?
Confused by her rush to get away from him, Chance hurries on, as if he had somewhere important to be, until he reaches a group of boys.
Mr. Thomas Franklin told me I must leave the old man's house. He's dead, you know.
Annoyed and hoping to threaten Chance, the boy pulls out a knife on the gardener, who responds by taking a remote out of his pocket and vainly trying to click the boy out of existence, like he's been used to doing to a program he doesn't like on his TV screen, but fails miserably. Doubting their eyes, the amused and annoyed boys make fun of the insane attempt. Chance continues walking for a few more hours until he finds a statue of a man pointing to the right side of the street, stares at it for a moment, and reverses his direction, as if following its order, and starts going right. After a few more hours, Chance sees a dead tree from afar, rushes towards it, and inspects it with sheer concern. He then approaches a police officer.
Yes, sir. I'll report it right away.
Thank you.
Chance then resumes his walk, and oblivious to his surroundings, walks in the middle of the road. In the evening, as he passes by a store, Chance sees himself captured by a video camera on a shop's window. Fascinated to find himself on the other side of the screen for once, Chance tries to work out how it's all possible, walks side to side on the street trying to discover more, and even tries to use his remote to turn it off, but fails miserably and walks backwards. Seconds later, Chance inadvertently steps off the sidewalk onto the street and is bumped by a limousine. Mortified, one of the drivers, David, who happens to be the personal chauffeur of the wealthy Eve Rand, who's the wife of business mogul Ben Rand, runs out of the car and approaches Chance.
It should be examined. We could take you to a hospital.
Relieved by his boss's kind demeanor, David profusely apologizes to Eve for the inconvenience. Then, Chance proceeds to follow her into the car until he remembers he's never been inside one, and hesitates until the second driver, Jeffrey, assures him that he's in good hands and convinces him to join Eve in the back seat. The drivers then load Chance's suitcase in the trunk and start on their way.
You know, why don't you come to our house and we could take care of you there?
I agree.
Fine.
Glad to hear his agreement, Eve tells her drivers to take them home and call ahead to inform the staff that she's coming with an injured guest. Eve then offers Chance a drink, which he gladly accepts.
May I watch television, please?
Why, yes. Certainly.
Hoping to get to know the man she will be hosting in her home, Eve asks him his name.
Well,
Chance Gardner.
To the amusement of Eve, Chance then starts emptying his pockets looking for his remote, and when he fails to find it, manually changes the channel to the news. Chance instantly changes the channel once more and, to the bewilderment of Eve, quickly becomes absorbed by the cartoon movie playing on the TV. Unaware that Eve is staring at him with sheer confusion, Chance attentively follows the plot of the cartoon movie and thoroughly enjoys it. Soon, the duo arrives at the Rand's mansion, and once they enter the gate, numerous staff await them outside the front door with a wheelchair for Chance and greet them professionally, where Eve tells one of the staff, Wilson, to take him to a guest bedroom upstairs and arranges for the family doctor, Dr. Robert Allenby, to see him. Wilson then wheels Chance into a small elevator and proceeds to take him upstairs to his room.
Does it have a television? How long do we stand here?
Oh, the misunderstanding. Dr. Robert visits Chance in his room, and as he proceeds to give him a shot, Chance shares that he had seen similar procedures on TV. Amused, the doctor gives him the shot and plans to get an X-ray of Chance's leg, just to confirm that there's no serious injury.
Are you planning on making any sort of claim against the Rands?
There's no need for a claim. I don't even know what they look like.
As the doctor laughs at what he thinks is a joke, Chance turns on the TV in the room and starts flipping through channels, half listening to Dr. Robert, who explains the risk of minor hemorrhage, expected in his case.
Mr. Wilson, please wheel Mr. Gardner in for x-rays after you've finished unpacking.
On the other side of the mansion, Eve hurries to see her old, sick husband in his room and warmly greets him.
Gardner, Chauncey Gardner.
Gardner.
Then, Ben proposes that Chance should join them for dinner, and Eve agrees to make the necessary preparations. Later, Dr. Robert meets with Eve to discuss Chance's injury.
And I'd like to keep an eye on him, so I suggested that he stay here for a couple of days.
Meanwhile, following the doctor's orders, Wilson wheels Chance to the infirmary for the X-ray.
Welcome to Rand Memorial Hospital.
Moments later, in the infirmary, Chance meets Ben, who welcomes him warmly and, sensing his guest's reaction to the highly oxygenated room, Ben shares that he had especially arranged for his private infirmary to be sealed and oxygenated to lift his spirit and make him feel better. Then, Ben tells Chance about his illness.
And I'm about to die of a young person's disease.
Ben then extends a dinner invitation to Chance, who gladly accepts the offer and shares openly how hungry he is. Once finished with the test, Chance joins Ben, Eve, and Dr. Robert for dinner. Sympathizing with Chance, whose words he completely misunderstands and who he believes is a professional businessman just like himself, Ben tries to get to know him better.
I would like to work in your garden.
No, Ben, he means that literally. Believing they are all on the same page, Chance responds and explains his situation further.
I'm a very good gardener.
After dinner, while the doctor observes, Chance and Ben spend some time together.
Fertilize it.
I will, Ben.
Afterwards, Wilson wheels Chance to the elevator and once inside starts laughing preemptively, expecting Chance to make what he considers another joke and quickly apologizes for his behavior. Then, as Wilson wheels Chance to his room, Eve approaches him and, despite her earlier apprehension, informs him how happy she is to have him around.
You lifted Ben's spirits tonight to such an extent. Do you know that?
The next morning, the Secret Service arrives early to make the necessary preparations.
Shall we set up the communications in the usual place?
Of course.
Meanwhile, Chance wakes up early and walks outside, hoping to visit the garden. However, as soon as he steps out, one of the staff members asks him if he wants a car to be provided for him, and Chance excitedly agrees and thanks the man in advance. However, moments later, Dr. Robert rushes towards Chance with Wilson by his side, lightly scolds him for not taking the recommended rest, sits him in a wheelchair, checks on his patient's injuries, and is relieved to see that the swelling has gone down and is healing quite well. What was the car for then? Pushing this bizarre and confusing interaction aside, the doctor updates Chance about the events taking place at the estate that day.
Anyway, the president has volunteered to sit in for Ben at the convention.
After walking for a few minutes, Chance returns and prepares for the president's arrival. Then, while waiting for Ben, Chance tries to turn on the TV but fails miserably. Moments later, Ben, who has been groomed and dressed impeccably in honor of the president's arrival, joins Chance and confesses that his nurses have tried hard to make sure he looked presentable for the honorable guest. Then, the duo chats.
Nurse Teresa did a very good job there.
Meanwhile, On the other side of the estate, seeing that Chance is occupied with Ben, Dr. Robert decides to use the opportunity to learn more about their guest, who is unlike anyone he's ever met, sneaks into his room, and discreetly goes through his items. As scheduled at 10 o'clock, the president's entourage starts arriving at the estate, followed by the president. Ben sends his guest to wait for him in the library and, hoping to make a good impression, summons all his strength to leave his wheelchair, stand up, and slowly walk to his meeting, telling Chance, who remains by his side, more about himself.
Wealth provided me with considerable influence.
Ben and Chance then enter the library where the president waits to meet his lifelong friend, and Ben greets him warmly. Once the greetings and compliments are out of the way, Ben sits down and proudly presents Chance, who extends the same handshake he had watched the president do on TV.
On television, Mr. President, you look much smaller.
The president then attempts to start his discussion with Ben, but is continuously disrupted by Chance. Then, once Chance settles down, the meeting is underway.
As long as the roots are not severed, all is well.
Taking Chance's humble opinion on the matter to be an insightful economic piece of advice, the men are impressed, and Ben proudly and delightfully claps for his new friend.
There will be growth in the spring.
Then, having concluded the meeting on a high note, the president proceeds to leave. Once they see the president off, Chance and Ben hail his decency and proudly discuss the pleasant meeting they had, while the president rushes off with his entourage.
But I think you're just the man to take charge.
As they leave the library, the beaming Ben reminds Chance of the discussion they had the night before. Then, Ben explains that he's fatigued by the pleasant chaos of the morning and excuses himself.
I'm sorry you're so sick, Ben.
Aw, so sincere. Later that day, as per his request, Eve gives Chance a tour of the massive garden and takes him to the greenhouse, watching closely how captivated he is by his surroundings.
You must have been very close to him.
I was here.
Then, hoping to get to know the mysterious man who seems to be adored by everyone, Eve strikes up a conversation.
You mentioned also that Louise. Were you very close with Louise?
Later, Eve, Chance, and the doctor all join Ben in his room to watch the president's speech and become incredibly excited by what they hear. Unfortunately, moments later, the fatigue of the demanding day catches up with Ben, and he suddenly becomes ill. The doctor quickly responds and, together with the nurses, works hard to stabilize the old man while he orders Eve and Chance out of the room to spare them from watching the stressful ordeal. Outside, Chance keeps the terrified Eve company as she waits to hear about her husband's status and discusses how to move forward. The secretary calls out to Chance.
Sidney Courtney, the financial editor of the Washington Post.
Chance remains frozen for a few minutes, a gesture the tearful Eve confuses for concern towards her, and encourages Chance to take the call. As Chance walks away, the doctor absent-mindedly agrees with Eve's compliments towards the mysterious guest, while watching Chance walk away, skipping like a child in an amusement park. As he speaks to the editor, Chance watches a yoga instructor on TV, completely becomes absorbed by her movements, and keeps repeating the same answer to the editor, before completely forgetting that he's even on the phone, hangs up, glues his eyes to the TV, and starts mimicking her movements.
Yes, the show will be taped and then shown at 10 o'clock.
Elsewhere, the president receives the results of the background search on Chance.
I plan to contact Mr. Ranser just a minute.
I do not want Ben disturbed.
Meanwhile, Chance arrives at the Gary Burns show and is escorted inside. Intelligence agencies continue their search for the now prominent Chance. Meanwhile, at the show, Chance is taken backstage for makeup, given tips on how to handle the upcoming interview before being invited on stage. During the interview, Gary pointedly asks Chance how such a brilliant man working so closely with the president had managed to remain anonymous for so long, and invites him to give his professional opinion on the country's current economic strategies. As always, Chance remains gracefully tight-lipped, and when he does speak, he talks about the only thing he knows about, gardening. He calmly shares what is expected of a serious gardener. The host and the nation understand to be an insightful metaphor for the economy, and even the president stops everything he's doing and holds his breath to hear what Chance thinks of his policies.
Sounds as if we need a lot of gardening here.
We certainly do.
Once finished with the interview, while being driven away, Chance turns on the TV in the car and watches his own interview, along with the rest of the nation. Ben and Eve sit in Ben's room, proudly watching and feeling blessed to know such a brilliant man. Then, Ben unexpectedly asks his wife how she feels about Chance and seems somehow comforted to learn that she's quite fond of him. Meanwhile, the doctor follows the interview with more skepticism. Elsewhere, Thomas also sees the show and is surprised to see how impressed and enchanted his girlfriend becomes with Chance, and is perplexed, as the narrative is the complete opposite of the timid, confusing man he had met and thrown out on the streets only recently. On the other side of the city, Louise catches the show, and knowing the man she catered to for decades better than anyone, she is flabbergasted by what she witnesses.
All you gotta be is white in America to get whatever you want.
At the estate, Chance returns from the show and is welcomed at the front door by the excited staff. Chance heads inside and reunites with the Rands and Dr. Robert, who warmly welcome him.
You have the gift of being natural.
Later, once it's decided, Eve and Chance discuss the event and the appropriate attire required. While he remains frozen, Eve kisses Chance and heads to her room. A couple of days later, overwhelmed by the growing media attention on Chance and his prominence, Thomas and Sally meet up to discuss him.
Oh, he was very clever, keeping it at a third-grade level.
At the White House, during the president's briefing, unable to admit defeat and growing increasingly frustrated over the lack of information on Chance, who seems to have fallen out of the clear blue sky, the agents grab at straws.
This man carries no identification. Computers have analyzed his,
One morning, at the estate, while Chance enjoys his breakfast in bed and watches TV, an excited Eve comes to deliver great news.
No, Eve. I'd like you to be here.
Unexpectedly, Eve makes advances towards Chance, who just sits back, not knowing how to respond for minutes on end. Then, Eve suddenly straightens up, thanks him for being strong enough to resist his urges, and while he stares at her with a blank look, she slowly leaves the room. On the other side of the mansion, unlike everyone else who's under Chance's charm, Dr. Robert calls Thomas's office and leaves his number and a message. A few nights later, while Ben lies in bed, growing weaker each day, Chance escorts Eve to the reception and is interviewed as soon as he arrives.
Mr. Gardner, what was your reaction to the Post's editorial on the president's speech?
Once they get inside, Eve admires Chance's calm demeanor and excellent way of handling the media and compliments him. Chance is then introduced to the Russian ambassador.
Regretfully, we shall yield the pleasure of your company to others.
Then, Chance joins the ambassador at his table.
Our chairs are almost touching.
On the other side of the party, intelligence agents meet to discuss the curious case, ponder why Chance's past has been wiped clean, and wonder if he had a criminal history. Then, hoping to figure out the mystery once and for all, Dr. Robert meets Thomas to discuss Chance.
He was a child working as a gardener.
Meanwhile, the ambassador tries to get to know Chance. Taking Chance's silence as a confirmation, the ambassador starts to speak to him in Russian. Despite having no idea of what's being said, Chance laughs with the duo, convincing them that he can understand them. On the other side of the party, Thomas and the doctor continue their discussion. Afterwards, Eve once again congratulates Chance for impressing the Russian ambassador and hails him for his social skills.
Chauncey, you had the Russian ambassador eating right out of your hand, you know that?
Then, Chance meets Ronald and greets him warmly.
I can't write.
Of course not. Who can nowadays? Listen, I have trouble writing a postcard to my children.
No, Ronald. He means he literally can't write or read. Meanwhile, Thomas and the doctor conclude their meeting. On the other hand, the senator discusses Chance. Elsewhere, at the White House, while in bed with his wife, dealing with marital issues, the president receives a call.
Get Baldwin and Honeycutt over here. I'll be right down.
Oblivious to the stir he had created at the party, a calm Chance drives back with Eve.
Ben understands my feelings for you, by the way, and he accepts them.
At the White House, the president holds an emergency meeting with the head of the FBI and the head of the CIA.
Gardner is not a foreign agent. There are now 16 countries investigating the man.
Wow, the escalation. At the estate, having found out all he needed about Chance from the lawyer, the doctor returns to inform his longtime friend and patient, Ben, the truth. Then, Dr. Robert heads to the infirmary, finds Ben writing his will and putting his affairs in order, and interrupts him to discuss Chance.
Ben, I'd like to talk to you about Chauncey.
Seeing how much Chance means to the old dying man and hearing him speak so fondly of him, the doctor realizes that nothing is worth ruining Ben's last few days and decides to keep everything he's found out to himself. On the other side of the estate, while Chance watches TV in his room, he sees a couple kissing and mimics the scene with Eve, who is delighted by the reciprocation of affection. However, When the movie ends moments later and a yoga instructor comes on the screen, Chance leaves Eve and starts following the moves on the screen and practices yoga with sheer curiosity. Meanwhile, on the other side of the estate, Ben's health deteriorates, and after being informed, the doctor rushes to his room to help him. However, utterly exhausted by the seemingly endless treatments and pain, Ben refuses any more interventions and convinces the doctor to respect his wish. Then, Ben has Chance brought to his room, and as the doctor watches on, hoping to speak in what he believes is Chance's brilliant metaphorical lingo, Ben explains that Eve is a delicate flower that needs care, and asks Chance to stay at the estate after he's gone and take care of her. Ben then shares that he has told his colleagues all about Chance, and that they are all excited to work with him. However, moments later, before Ben can finish his train of thought or leave a message for his dear wife, he dies. Devastated by the loss, Chance is flooded by emotions and tears up. Then, just as he had done with the late Mr. Jennings, Chance reaches out and touches Ben's forehead as a solemn gesture of farewell and stares at the now lifeless figure until the doctor breaks the sheer silence.
You've become quite a close friend of Eve's, haven't you?
Seemingly oblivious to what the doctor is trying to imply, Chance opts to inform Eve of the tragedy and walks out of the room, leaving behind the doctor, who watches Chance closely, muttering to himself that he understands now. At Ben's funeral, Ben's quotes are read as everyone gathers and solemnly watches the pallbearers carrying the casket to its resting place. Moments later, Chance leaves Eve's side, quietly walks away from the service, and heads into the surrounding snowy woods. Meanwhile, knowing that the current president has no real future in office, as they walk away, the pallbearers discuss the next election and potential nominees.
We are all children.
Well, what about Chauncey Gardner? But what do we know of the man?
That is exactly why I agree with Ben's final wishes.
Utterly oblivious to his potential nomination for the presidency, Chance quietly and somberly continues walking through the woods to the nearby river. There, at the edge of the river, Chance removes some fallen branches from a small plant, rescuing it and straightening it so it can grow and flourish. Then, as a quote preaching that life is a state of mind rings out from the funeral service on the other side, Chance marches straight onto the water and walks on it, without sinking, as if he were walking on solid ground. Moments later, Chance stops to test the depth of the river, dips his umbrella into the river to confirm that it's quite deep, but seemingly unfazed by this, continues walking on.